The crisp autumn morning of October 2012 found Barack Obama preparing for what would become one of the most unusual encounters of his presidency. The White House staff bustled with their typical efficiency, but there was something different in the air today. The president had received an invitation that had puzzled even his most experienced advisors. Queen Elizabeth II had personally requested a private meeting at Buckingham Palace, but this wasn't the usual diplomatic visit. The invitation came with specific instructions that seemed almost mysterious. Obama was to arrive alone without his usual security detail and meet with a single member of the Royal Guard who had served the crown for over 3 decades. As Air Force One touched down at Heathrow Airport, Obama felt an unusual nervousness. Throughout his political career, he had faced world leaders, hostile crowds, and intense media scrutiny with remarkable composure. His ability to remain calm under pressure had become legendary among his staff. Yet something about this particular meeting unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite understand. The drive to Buckingham Palace was unusually quiet. Even his small accompanying team seemed to sense the weight of the moment. The streets of London blurred past as Obama reviewed his notes one final time, though he realized he had no idea what to prepare for. The Queen's message had been cryptic, mentioning only that there was something the Royal Guard needed to share with him personally. Upon arrival at the palace, Obama was struck by the solemnity of the atmosphere. The usual grandeur was present, but there was an underlying tension that even the ornate decorations couldn't mask. A palace aide speaking in hushed tones escorted him through corridors he had never seen before, deeper into the heart of the royal residence than any previous visit had taken him. The aide stopped before an unremarkable door and gestured for Obama to enter alone. Inside, he found a simply furnished room with 2 chairs facing each other. Standing at attention was a man whose presence immediately commanded respect. The Royal Guard appeared to be in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that held the weight of countless secrets. His uniform was impeccable, every detail perfect, but there was something in his expression that suggested this meeting would be far from routine. The guard introduced himself simply as Thomas Whitmore, offering no rank or additional credentials. His voice carried the authority of someone who had dedicated his life to serving the crown, but there was also a tremor of emotion that seemed barely contained. Obama settled into his chair, his usual diplomatic smile in place, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to shift in ways he couldn't imagine. Whitmore began to speak, his words measured and careful. He explained that he had served the royal family for 32 years, witnessing moments of triumph and tragedy, joy and sorrow. He had been present during some of the most significant events in recent British history, standing guard while history unfolded around him. But nothing, he said, had prepared him for what he was about to share. The room seemed to grow smaller as Whitmore continued. He spoke of loyalty, duty, and the weight of keeping secrets that could change the course of nations. Obama found himself leaning forward, his political instincts recognizing that this was no ordinary briefing. Whatever Whitmore was about to reveal had the power to reshape his understanding of international relations, perhaps even his view of the world itself. As the minutes ticked by, Obama felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. The Royal Guard's words were building toward something momentous, something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the relationship between nations, about power, and about the hidden forces that shaped global events. The president, who had faced down political opponents and international crises with unwavering calm, found himself unprepared for the revelation that was about to unfold in this quiet room deep within Buckingham Palace. Thomas Whitmore reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Obama watched as the guard's hands, steady despite the gravity of the moment, carefully opened the seal. The paper inside appeared to be decades old, covered in handwriting that seemed both urgent and precise. "Mr. President," Whitmore began, his voice carrying a weight that made Obama straighten in his chair. "What I'm about to share with you has been hidden from every American leader since the end of World War II. The Queen herself insisted that you be the one to finally learn the truth." The Royal Guard's eyes never left Obama's face as he explained that during the final months of the war, a joint operation between British and American intelligence had uncovered something extraordinary. Hidden in the basement of a bombed German facility, Allied forces had discovered documents that would change their understanding of modern warfare forever. But the discovery had been so sensitive, so potentially dangerous that both governments agreed to bury it completely. Obama felt his mouth go dry as Whitmore continued. The documents revealed that certain technologies developed during the war had capabilities far beyond what either side had imagined. More disturbing still was the evidence that some of these innovations had been deliberately concealed from military leadership, developed by a small group of scientists who answered to no single government. The implications were staggering, Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper. If this information had been made public, it would have changed the entire post-war order. The balance of power, the formation of NATO, the Cold War itself, everything would have unfolded differently. As the Royal Guard spoke, Obama found himself gripping the arms of his chair. His mind raced through the implications of what he was hearing. Throughout his presidency, he had access to the highest levels of classified information. Yet this revelation seemed to exist in a category entirely its own. The careful diplomatic relationships he had spent years building suddenly seemed fragile, built on foundations that might not be as solid as he had believed. Whitmore explained that the secret had been passed down through a select few individuals in both countries, each sworn to protect it until the time was right for revelation. The Queen's father, King George VI, had been one of the original keepers of this knowledge. President Truman had been briefed, but had chosen to maintain the silence. Every subsequent leader had been deemed either unsuitable for the burden or too close to other international complications to risk exposure. "But you're different, Mr. President," the guard continued. "Her Majesty believes you have the strength to handle this knowledge and the wisdom to decide what should be done with it." Obama felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. The weight of unseen responsibility was settling on his shoulders, heavier than any decision he had faced in the Oval Office. The careful political calculations that had guided his presidency seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what Whitmore was revealing. The Royal Guard reached for another document, this one more recent. Obama could see that it contained photographs, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be correspondence between various government officials. The complexity of the material was immediately apparent, but what struck him most was the level of detail that had been maintained over the decades. "The technology in question," Whitmore said, his voice gaining strength as he moved deeper into the revelation, "relates to communication systems that were far more advanced than anything publicly acknowledged. But the real discovery was not the technology itself, but evidence of how it had been used." Obama's composure, famous for its unshakable nature, began to show the first visible cracks. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. The diplomatic smile that had carried him through countless international meetings had completely disappeared, replaced by an expression of growing concern and disbelief. The room seemed to pulse with tension as Whitmore prepared to reveal the most crucial part of his story. Obama realized that his understanding of history, of international relations, and perhaps of reality itself, was about to be fundamentally challenged. The president who had prided himself on remaining calm in any crisis found himself facing information that threatened to shatter everything he thought he knew about the world he led. Whitmore spread the photographs across the small table between them, and Obama leaned forward to examine them more closely. The images were grainy but unmistakable. They showed communication equipment that appeared decades ahead of its time, housed in facilities that looked nothing like the military installations he was familiar with. More disturbing were the documents that accompanied the photos, showing communication logs between locations that officially didn't exist. "Mr. President," the Royal Guard said, his voice taking on an almost confessional tone, "these facilities were not built by any government. They were constructed and operated by a group that had members in multiple countries, people who held positions of significant influence but answered to an agenda that transcended national boundaries." Obama felt his carefully constructed worldview beginning to crumble. Throughout his political career, he had operated under the assumption that while governments might keep secrets from their people, the basic structure of international relations was what it appeared to be. The idea that there might be organized groups operating outside governmental control, with access to advanced technology and influence over global events, was almost too much to process. The Royal Guard continued his explanation, detailing how the communication network had been used to coordinate actions across different countries without the knowledge of official government channels. Elections had been influenced, economic policies had been shaped, and international conflicts had been either prevented or encouraged based on the agenda of this shadow organization. But how is this possible? Obama asked, his voice betraying the strain of trying to maintain his composure. How could something this significant remain hidden for so long? Whitmore smiled grimly and pulled out another set of documents. These showed a pattern of strategic placement of individuals in key positions across multiple governments and international organizations. The scope was breathtaking. Members of this group had been positioned in intelligence agencies, diplomatic corps, major corporations, and media organizations across the globe. Obama's mind raced as he tried to understand the implications. How many of the international relationships he had carefully cultivated were influenced by this hidden network? How many of the crises he had managed as president had been orchestrated or manipulated by forces he didn't even know existed? The questions multiplied faster than he could process them. The most disturbing part, Whitmore continued, is that we believe this network is still active. The technology has evolved, the methods have become more sophisticated, but the basic structure remains in place. They've simply become better at hiding their influence. The Royal Guard explained that intelligence services in both Britain and America had been tracking suspicious patterns for years, but the scope of the organization made it nearly impossible to investigate without risking exposure. Too many people in positions of authority might be compromised, and any large-scale investigation could alert the network to shut down or relocate their operations. Obama stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the palace gardens. The normalcy of the scene outside seemed surreal given the conversation taking place just feet away. Gardeners tended to flower beds while tourists took photographs, completely unaware that the foundations of international order were being questioned in the room above them. "Why now?" Obama asked, turning back to face Whitmore. "Why reveal this to me at this moment?" The Royal Guard's expression grew even more serious. "Because we have reason to believe they're planning something significant, Mr. President. Something that could affect both our countries in ways we can't fully predict. The Queen believes that only by working together, with full knowledge of what we're facing, do we have any chance of protecting our people." Obama felt his legs grow weak as the full weight of responsibility settled on him. This wasn't just about managing a diplomatic crisis or navigating a political challenge. If Whitmore was telling the truth, he was being asked to help defend against a threat that operated outside all normal channels of governance and accountability. The president, who had built his reputation on thoughtful, measured responses, found himself struggling to process information that challenged the very foundations of how he understood power to work in the modern world. His famous composure, tested by political battles and international crises, was facing its greatest challenge yet. Whitmore watched Obama's internal struggle with sympathy, but also with urgency. "There's more, Mr. President," he said quietly. "The most crucial part of what you need to know relates to something that's happening right now. Something that could change everything within a matter of weeks." Whitmore moved to a secure cabinet built into the wall of the room, using a key that hung on a chain around his neck. Inside were files that looked more recent, some bearing dates from just weeks earlier. Obama watched with growing dread as the Royal Guard selected several thick folders and returned to the table. "What I'm about to show you," Whitmore said, "represents the most current intelligence we have about their planned operation. Our sources suggest it involves simultaneous actions in multiple countries, designed to create a crisis that would allow them to consolidate power in ways that have never been possible before." The files contained surveillance reports, intercepted communications, and financial records that painted a picture of an organization preparing for something massive. Obama studied the documents with the same attention he gave to national security briefings, but the scale and sophistication of what he was seeing far exceeded anything in his previous experience. According to the intelligence, the network had been positioning assets for months, moving large amounts of money through complex financial instruments, and establishing communication protocols that would allow them to coordinate actions across continents. Most disturbing was evidence that they had been working to compromise key infrastructure systems in multiple countries. "They're not planning to take control through traditional means," Whitmore explained. They're going to create a situation where normal governmental functions become impossible, forcing populations to accept alternative forms of authority just to maintain basic services and security. Obama felt his hands shaking as he turned the pages. The level of planning was extraordinary, involving backup systems for their backup systems, contingencies for scenarios that seemed almost impossible to predict. This wasn't the work of a few years or even a decade. This represented generational planning with resources that rivaled those of major governments. "How certain are you about this information?" Obama asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the thoroughness of the documentation. "Certain enough that the Queen authorized me to share state secrets that have been protected for over 60 years, Whitmore replied. "Certain enough that she's prepared to risk the exposure of this entire intelligence operation if it means preventing what's coming." The Royal Guard explained that British intelligence had managed to infiltrate certain levels of the organization, but not deeply enough to fully understand their timeline or methods. What they did know was that the window for action was closing rapidly. Within weeks, possibly days, the network would be in position to execute their plan. Obama stood again, this time moving to the other side of the room where historical portraits looked down with expressions that seemed almost accusatory. He wondered how many of the leaders depicted in those paintings had faced similar moments of choice, times when the comfortable assumptions of governance were stripped away to reveal harder truths about power and control. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Obama said, turning back to face Whitmore. "Even if I accept everything you're telling me, I can't just act on intelligence from another country without involving my own security apparatus. And if this organization has the kind of penetration you suggest, any official action could compromise the entire operation." Whitmore nodded grimly. "That's exactly the dilemma we face, Mr. President. Traditional governmental responses may be impossible because we can't know who to trust, but doing nothing guarantees that their plan succeeds. The Royal Guard outlined a preliminary strategy that would involve careful coordination between a select few individuals in both governments, people who had been thoroughly vetted over years of observation. The approach would require Obama to make decisions and take actions that went far beyond normal presidential authority, operating in gray areas that might not technically be legal under traditional oversight structures. "You're asking me to essentially run a shadow operation against another shadow operation," Obama said, the strain evident in his voice. "To fight a secret conspiracy with a secret conspiracy of our own." "I understand how it sounds," Whitmore replied, "but consider the alternative. If we follow normal procedures, by the time our investigations are complete and our responses are approved through proper channels, their operation will be finished. The world they create afterward may not have room for the kinds of democratic institutions you've spent your career defending." Obama felt his famous composure finally beginning to crack in earnest. The weight of the decision before him was unlike anything he had faced, even during the most intense crises of his presidency. This wasn't about policy differences or political calculations. This was about the fundamental nature of how power operated in the modern world. The president who had built his reputation on bringing transparency and accountability to government found himself being asked to operate in the deepest shadows, using methods that contradicted many of his core principles. Yet the alternative, allowing an unaccountable network to potentially reshape global governance, seemed even more incompatible with everything he believed in. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like hours as Obama processed everything he had learned. Whitmore remained perfectly still, understanding that the president needed time to absorb the magnitude of what was being asked of him. The weight of decades of hidden history, combined with the urgency of immediate action, created a pressure unlike anything Obama had ever experienced. Finally, Obama spoke, his voice quieter than it had been throughout their meeting. "Tell me about the people I would be working with. If I agree to this, I need to know exactly who else would be involved and what their roles would be." Whitmore pulled out a final folder, this one containing biographical information on a small group of individuals from various countries and organizations. Each file was extensive, showing not just professional credentials, but detailed psychological profiles and evidence of their trustworthiness over many years of observation. "These are people who have been carefully selected and vetted over the course of decades," the Royal Guard explained. "Some of them don't even know about the others. but each has demonstrated both the competence and the integrity necessary for this kind of operation. Obama studied the files with growing amazement. The group included people from his own administration that he had never suspected of involvement in such activities, intelligence operatives from allied countries, and even individuals in private sector positions who had apparently been working as unofficial assets for years. The level of long-term planning required to assemble such a network was staggering. "How long have you been planning for this possibility?" Obama asked, beginning to understand that his invitation to this meeting was not as spontaneous as it had seemed. "Mr. President," Whitmore replied with something approaching a smile, "your presidency was seen as an opportunity from the moment you announced your candidacy. Not because of your political positions, but because of your demonstrated ability to make difficult decisions under pressure and your commitment to protecting democratic institutions." The Royal Guard explained that Obama's response to various international crises had been carefully observed, not just by foreign governments but by the network of individuals dedicated to countering the shadow organization. His handling of complex situations, his ability to work with international partners, and his skill at maintaining operational security had all been noted and evaluated. "We've been preparing for the possibility of this conversation since 2008, Whitmore continued. "Every major decision you've made as president has been analyzed not just for its immediate political impact, but for what it revealed about your character and your willingness to take necessary action even when it's difficult." Obama felt a chill as he realized that his entire presidency had been observed and evaluated by people he had never known existed. The decisions he thought he was making independently had been watched and judged by individuals who were planning for scenarios he had never imagined. It was both unsettling and, in a strange way, validating that his leadership had been deemed worthy of such responsibility. "What happens if I say no?" Obama asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Whitmore's expression grew grim. "Then we proceed with a much smaller operation that has far less chance of success. The Queen would not have authorized this level of disclosure if there were viable alternatives. Mr. President, you represent our best hope of preventing something that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the world." The Royal Guard went on to explain that if their intelligence was correct, the shadow organization's operation would create a cascade of crises that would overwhelm normal governmental response capabilities. Economic systems would be disrupted, communication networks would be compromised, and traditional authority structures would be unable to maintain order. In the chaos that followed, new forms of governance would emerge, forms that would be controlled by the very people who had created the crisis. "It's not about conquest in any traditional sense," Whitmore said. "It's about creating conditions where people willingly surrender authority to whoever can provide stability and security. Once that transition occurs, restoring democratic governance becomes nearly impossible." Obama walked back to the window, looking out at the peaceful scene in the palace gardens. The contrast between the normalcy outside and the extraordinary conversation taking place in the room felt almost surreal. Ordinary people going about their daily lives, completely unaware that the future of democratic governance might be decided in the next few minutes. "If I agree," Obama said without turning around, "what exactly would be my first step? How does something like this actually begin?" Whitmore moved to stand beside him at the window. "The first step would be identifying which people in your own administration can be trusted with this knowledge. We have recommendations, but ultimately you would need to make those decisions based on your own judgment and experience with these individuals." The president turned to study the Royal Guard's profile, noting the absolute conviction in his expression. This was a man who had dedicated his life to serving something larger than himself, and who was now asking Obama to make a similar commitment. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming, but Obama also recognized that it might be exactly the kind of challenge he had unconsciously been preparing for throughout his political career. Obama returned to his chair, his decision weighing heavily on his mind. The room seemed smaller now, filled with the gravity of secrets that had shaped decades of hidden history. Whitmore watched patiently, understanding that this moment would define not just Obama's presidency, but potentially the future of democratic governance itself. "I need to ask you something," Obama said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his thoughts. In all your years of service, in all the secrets you've kept and the operations you've overseen, have you ever been wrong about something this significant? Whitmore considered the question carefully before responding. There have been times when our intelligence was incomplete, times when our assumptions proved incorrect. But, Mr. President, the evidence we have now is not based on assumptions or interpretations. We have documentation, recorded communications, and financial records that paint a clear picture of what's being planned. The Royal Guard reached for one final document, this one marked with classifications Obama had never seen before. As Whitmore opened it, Obama could see what appeared to be transcripts of recorded conversations, time-stamped and annotated with technical details about how they had been obtained. These recordings were made just last week, Whitmore explained. They represent discussions between key members of the network about final preparations for their operation. The timeline they discuss matches exactly with other intelligence we've gathered through independent sources. Obama read through the transcripts with growing alarm. The conversations revealed not just the scope of the planned operation, but the casual confidence of people who believed their success was inevitable. They discussed disrupting financial markets, compromising communication systems, and creating public panic with the detached professionalism of people planning a corporate restructuring. "My God," Obama whispered, his composure finally beginning to show serious cracks. "They're talking about millions of people as if they're pieces on a chessboard." "That's exactly what they are to this organization," Whitmore replied. "People are resources to be managed, not citizens with rights to be protected. Once you understand that fundamental difference in perspective, everything else about their operation makes sense." The transcripts revealed something else that chilled Obama to his core. References to previous operations that had been successful. Events that he had witnessed during his presidency, crises that had seemed like natural developments or unfortunate coincidences, were discussed as planned outcomes that had achieved their intended goals. "How many of the situations I've dealt with as president were actually orchestrated by these people?" Obama asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "More than you might suspect, fewer than you might fear," Whitmore said diplomatically. "They don't control everything, Mr. President. But they have certainly influenced more events than any democratic government should be comfortable with." Obama felt his hands begin to tremble as the full scope of what he was facing became clear. This wasn't just about preventing a future operation. It was about understanding that much of what he had experienced as president had been shaped by forces operating outside any accountability structure. The careful policy decisions, the international negotiations, the crisis management that had defined his presidency, all of it had taken place within a context he was only now beginning to understand. "I need to know something else," Obama said, looking directly at Whitmore. "If we succeed in stopping this operation, what happens next? Do we expose this organization publicly? Do we try to dismantle their entire network? What's the endgame?" The Royal Guard's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a decision that would need to be made carefully, with full consideration of the consequences. Exposing them publicly might prevent future operations, but it could also destabilize international relations in ways that create different, but equally serious problems." Whitmore explained that the network's influence extended into so many institutions that simply removing their people could create chaos in financial markets, intelligence services, and international organizations. The challenge would be neutralizing their ability to operate while maintaining the stability of the systems they had infiltrated. "In other words," Obama said, understanding dawning in his voice, "even if we win, we might have to keep operating in the shadows to prevent the collapse of the very institutions we're trying to protect." "That's a possibility we have to consider," Whitmore acknowledged. "Fighting monsters can sometimes require becoming something monstrous yourself, even when your intentions are to protect democratic values." Obama stood once more, this time moving to the center of the room where he could see both Whitmore and the documents spread across the table. The weight of the decision before him was unlike anything he had ever faced, requiring him to choose between principles he had held throughout his political career and actions that might be necessary to preserve the system those principles were meant to protect. The president who had built his reputation on transparency and accountability found himself being asked to operate in complete secrecy. The leader who had always sought consensus and consultation was being asked to make decisions that he couldn't discuss with his usual advisors. Everything that had defined his approach to governance was being challenged by the reality of what he now understood about how power actually operated in the modern world. "I need one final piece of information," Obama said, his voice carrying a new note of resolve. "I need to know exactly what you expect me to say when I leave this room." Whitmore gathered the documents carefully, returning them to their folders with practiced efficiency. Obama watched this final ritual, understanding that once those files disappeared back into their secure storage, his world would never be quite the same again. The knowledge he had gained in this room would travel with him for the rest of his life, shaping every decision he made as president and beyond. "When you leave here," Whitmore said, "you'll return to Air Force One and fly back to Washington as planned. Your official schedule will show that you had a successful diplomatic meeting with Her Majesty, discussing routine matters of mutual interest between our countries. No one will question anything unusual about your visit." The Royal Guard explained that Obama would have 48 hours to consider everything he had learned before any action would be required. During that time, he would need to identify the individuals in his administration who could be trusted with this knowledge, using the psychological profiles and recommendations Whitmore had provided as guidance. "The most crucial thing," Whitmore continued, "is that your behavior and routine remain completely normal during this period. Any deviation from your usual patterns could alert network members who might be observing your activities. They have demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their surveillance capabilities." Obama nodded, understanding the irony that his first act in this shadow war would be to maintain the very public persona that had defined his presidency. The president, known for his measured responses and careful deliberation, would need to use those same qualities to hide the most significant decision of his political career. "What about after the 48 hours?" Obama asked. "How will communication between our operations be maintained?" Whitmore smiled slightly, the first hint of warmth he had shown throughout their meeting. "Mr. President, if you agree to proceed, you'll discover that certain members of your staff have been prepared for this possibility far longer than you might expect. The network we've built to counter this threat includes people who have been positioned to help you, people you already trust, but whose full capabilities you haven't yet discovered." The revelation that some of his closest advisors might already be part of this operation was both comforting and unsettling. Obama realized that his presidency had been observed and supported by layers of assistance he had never suspected, people working to protect democratic institutions while operating completely outside official channels. "I have to ask," Obama said, "what happens if I'm unable to identify the right people to trust? What if I make the wrong choices about who to bring into this operation? Then we proceed with a smaller team and accept reduced chances of success," Whitmore replied honestly. "But Mr. President, your ability to judge character and inspire loyalty in capable people is one of the main reasons you were selected for this responsibility. We have confidence in your judgment, even in circumstances you've never faced before." Obama took one final look around the room that had contained the most extraordinary conversation of his life. The simple furniture and plain walls gave no hint of the world-changing secrets that had been shared within these walls. He wondered how many other such rooms existed, how many other conversations like this one had shaped the course of history without ever appearing in any official record. "I need you to know," Obama said, turning back to Whitmore, "that regardless of what I decide, I understand the trust you and the Queen have placed in me by sharing this information. That trust won't be taken lightly, whatever actions I ultimately choose to take." Whitmore stood and extended his hand, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of decades of hidden service and sacrifice. "Mr. President, in all my years of guarding secrets and serving the Crown, I've never encountered a situation where so much depended on the courage and wisdom of a single individual. I believe you're equal to this challenge, but I also understand the burden we're asking you to carry." As Obama shook the Royal Guard's hand, he felt the last remnants of his famous composure finally give way completely. The weight of everything he had learned, combined with the responsibility now resting on his shoulders, threatened to overwhelm him entirely. For a moment, the steady leadership that had defined his presidency cracked, revealing the human being beneath the political persona. "I've never heard anything like it," Whitmore said quietly, his voice filled with understanding and sympathy. No leader should have to face these kinds of choices. But sometimes history demands more of us than we ever thought we could give. Obama left Buckingham Palace that day carrying knowledge that would reshape his understanding of power, governance, and the hidden forces that influenced world events. The president who had entered that simple room with his characteristic confidence and composure emerged as a man forever changed by the weight of secrets that could alter the course of human history. As Air Force One lifted off from Heathrow Airport, Obama stared out the window at the London skyline below, knowing that somewhere in that sprawling city, plans were being made to counter a threat that most people would never know existed. The comfortable certainties of democratic governance had been stripped away, replaced by a more complex and dangerous reality that would define the rest of his presidency and beyond. The leader who had built his career on bringing change to Washington now faced the ultimate test of that commitment, challenged to protect democratic institutions through methods that challenged everything he had believed about how leaders should operate in a free society.